Drop a comment down below if, like me back in the day, you were inputting custom picture profile settings like a video game cheat code to try and unlock really good colors in your Canon DSLR. Thankfully, things have gotten a lot easier, and with built-in log profiles, you can get the best image quality with hardly any work. But don't let that be too intimidating. Today, we're going to dive into how to get the best colors out of your camera and why I might actually be switching back to Final Cut Pro for editing my wedding videos. If you watched my previous video on the Panasonic S1H, you know that I'm all about all things simplistic when it comes to color and post-production workflows. And honestly, for me, that was the first time I really started diving into figuring out how to get the colors to look the absolute best straight out of camera in a very simplistic way. Starting editing in Final Cut, I had very limited tools to work with, and it wasn't until I started editing in DaVinci Resolve that I started understanding what I was missing not having all of these color tools. Fast forward, one of the big things that I've been now trying to figure out is how to utilize the power of creative LUTs and technical conversion LUTs to be able to speed up my workflow and eventually make the return back to Final Cut so that I can edit all of my wedding videos there. But more on that later. Returning back to when I got my start in figuring out how to use color, one of the things that absolutely blew my mind was being able to utilize the scopes and waveforms. And while I'm not perfect, one of the things that can definitely help you improve your color workflow is being able to understand how to read these two measuring tools built into pretty much every single video editor. Now, side note, they definitely take quite a bit of extra processing power to have on screen, so you might have to be turning them on and off depending on where you're at in your color workflow, and you definitely don't want to have them on all the time. But diving into it, starting with waveforms, this is going to give you the most accurate map of the dynamic range of your entire scene and kind of where all of your exposure values are hitting. If you read any of the white papers on log profiles, like someone like me, this is going to be super helpful because you get to see that information mapped out across your image. And the waveform, basically imagine that as your image left to right, top to bottom, and where those values are lining up on that chart, that's where those values are in your image. Moving on to scopes. Now this one for me was a massive game changer when it came to doing anything color grading. My wife used to give me a hard time because my images tend to shift towards the green side of things. As a result, visually to me, I would always have to make things look way too magenta, which honestly probably ended up being too much of an overcorrection even in my final images. Fast forward, being able to utilize scopes, instead of having to guess and figure out where my color balances were lying, I could literally just measure the actual color instead of having to guess or rely on my apparently not perfect eyes to make those colors be what they're supposed to be. The scope basically allows you to see, where your colors are. They give you the actual color chips for the target of those colors if they were accurate. Now, from there, you can create your own creative looks and move things on from there. But knowing that you're starting with a color neutral starting point is going to give you the ability to get way more accurate color grades overall, because you're not actually starting with a shifted image, you're starting with a perfect baseline. The year is 2012. You're frantically Googling how to get your Canon DSLR to shoot a flat picture profile because the only thing you know about color is the last thing you want is that video look. You know what I'm talking about. The highlights are clipped to white if anything is slightly too bright, and the shadows are basically just a black muddy mess. You want that to be flat, and let's be honest, at the time we were all just chasing that one thing that we did not have: dynamic range. The cinematic look that we've been chasing forever, is that coveted RELX super soft highlight roll off, deep, fading into the smoothest of shadows. And on that point, something I want to address is in my diving into this whole situation, I've been understanding that there is something to be said for the way dynamic range is mapped in a camera. And we'll talk more about log profiles in a minute, but the way that a profile maps its dynamic range is a complex algorithm, and the way that ARI does it, for example, they tend to weigh their dynamic range towards the highlights. And so, while there's a lot of information in an ARI Alexa ProRes file, most of that information is allowing it to capture and store more highlight information, which allows them to do that super soft, dare I say, filmic highlight roll off. Whereas a company like Red or Sony, they tend to map a lot of their dynamic range more into the shadows, which gives you that, ability to shoot in low light, and also the ability to, underexpose your image if need be. So, you get a similar look being able to protect the highlights by underexposing, but whereas, on the Alexa, you can do a proper exposure and capture all those extra highlights. So, think back in the day, we as filmmakers were always, testing every single setting, changing contrast, saturation, color tone, picture profile, all the things. I think back to the days of, Canon and Sony picture profiles. It was almost like a cult, like, oh yeah, I use these settings, or, oh, that's horrible. Those magentas get real weird. I only use these settings. And it's crazy because now I think, pretty much all of that, I don't want to say is completely gone. If you're trying to do like ultra quick turnaround stuff, you're definitely going to be setting up your own picture profiles and creating something that is your specific look so that you can just drop it in and go without any color work. And if that's your move, go for it. I am all about that level of efficiency. So that's something I will be talking about later in the video, how I plan on using that in my workflows to be able to speed up everything that I do. The cool thing is now we have log profiles, and there's so much information out there, and I think something that we constantly are, trying to battle is how do we actually work with this? Because log is like a very, very smart mathematical way of taking all of the dynamic range from a sensor and compressing it into the little video files that we have. And honestly, a lot of it goes way above my head, but I'll do the best to explain it here. Basically, the way that color information is captured in terms of like luminance is the higher the luminance value, the more information it takes to store that in a video file. That's why, if you take photos on a camera, if you take a photo that is typically brighter, and we're not talking like a massive shift in file size, we're talking like zero 0.1 megabytes. But I even noticed this on my DSLR back in the day. Like, you take a brighter scene, it's going to be like 5.2 megabytes versus the, darker scenes are going to be like 4.9 or something like that. And part of that has to do with the luminance takes more information. So applying that all into a log profile, some very, very smart engineers created a way to input a gamma curve that allowed us to map more of those brighter values and compress that into like the midtone area, and then being able to use something like a LUT, be able to expand that back out to those ultra bright highlights and cleaner shadows. So with all the complicatedness of log profiles, I think that the color tools we have access to is one of the biggest things that's allowed us to get way better colors out of these cameras than were previously available. While programs like DaVinci Resolve have been around for a very long time, they were typically only accessible at the absolute highest level. That's why there was that image discrepancy between big post-production houses in Hollywood and your average independent small-scale production. with Resolve being available to everyone now at a reasonably affordable price, I mean, you can get the free version that can do a lot of things pretty much straight out of the box. That's going to allow us to have exponentially better colors across the board for everyone. Back in 2021, I made the switch full-time to DaVinci Resolve. I kind of had to jump in both feet because I absolutely love the magnetic timeline and the auto retime features in Final Cut Pro. But once I made that switch, I'm so happy I did because I've been able to notice personally for me, the colors in my videos have gotten exponentially better. Now, I definitely had that dip. The first project I edited in Resolve, I made a pact that I was not going to use any LUTs whatsoever, which was hilariously bad. I look back on it and it's, like a bag of Skittles just got spilled all over the screen. Like, it's pretty horrible. I'm not going to make you watch that. But one of the things that's amazing for me now is being able to use Resolve. I now have like a handful of tools that I use pretty much on every single project. It's exponentially sped up my post-production workflow in terms of being able to get really, really good colors, but also not being super complicated, with also having the ability to really push things to the next level, get the colors super dialed in, and knowing that I have all of the tools at my disposal to make the best videos possible. Okay, so now I want to talk about the 4 tools that I use in DaVinci Resolve on almost every single project, depending on what the actual deliverables are. Starting out, color space transform. I use this exclusively when I'm working with log footage. I used to be in that world of using the LUTs that camera manufacturers provided, but if you've downloaded any of the ones from Sony or Canon, you know that they're not fantastic. I think Sony's got those zombie skin tones that kind of shift a little bit more towards like the yellow. They do have like a handful of other looks, which are really cool and a good starting place, but just they're not for me. So using color space transform, whatever magic DaVinci Resolve has going on in the background, it has been one of the most color accurate, easy ways for me to do my fast log to Rec 709 transform to get me to a good starting place in my grades. So the second tool that I use on pretty much every single project now is the HDR wheels. And oh my gosh, these are absolutely my favorite tools to use on everything. They allow me to get the most dynamic range out of my images and allow me to really nail the exposure and HDR tone mapping of my image. I got a shout out to Blaine Westrop for this one because I just learned you can actually map the color space and gamma in the HDR wheels to your camera, and it literally, like, the adjustments are as if you were just actually like changing your exposure in camera. It's way more accurate, and I feel like even for me, the biggest thing I noticed using this on a wedding a couple weeks ago, I was able to actually fix really, really bad white balance adjustments. We were shooting this wedding, it was a little bit darker, and I was honestly really struggling to get my white balance nailed in and being able to edit it in post, and you almost can't tell. Like, it was absolutely incredible to see that. Okay, so the last 2 tools that I use in DaVinci Resolve are they kind of go hand in hand, and they also tie in a little bit to the first one with the color space transform. Now, admittedly, I started using color space transform because I really wanted to play around with other color spaces instead of whatever I was locked into with my camera. I think it was a video I saw about 2 or 3 months ago from Kazi. If you follow anything in the color grading world, you're probably familiar with his work. And he said something in that video that was Canon C500 Mark II, I believe, was the camera he was referencing. C-Log 2 is the closest you're going to get to an ARRI Alexa for under, 20 grand, basically. And that had me thinking, like, as someone who shoots on a Canon R6 and is constantly fighting the colors and all these things, I was like, wait a second, what if I shoot C-Log 3, bring it into Resolve, and use this whatever magical color space transform and transform it into Alexa log C, I think there's going to be some like opportunities here to be able to like fix the colors. The way that I use this is I use the color space transform tool to go from Canon C-Log 3, Canon Cine Gamut to ARRI Alexa log C3, or now that they have C4, I've kind of played around with that a little bit. It's not perfect, but the thing that really impresses me about the whole situation is you're able to get pretty amazing colors straight out of camera. And that Alexa log to 709 LUT, I mean, that's their magic sauce that gets you that Alexa look straight out of camera. And while it's not a perfect conversion over, I have noticed that the footage that I'm editing with, especially being 10-bit footage, has enough color information that you can really make that transition over and have more than enough information, as long as it's like properly exposed, to make those colors look as good as humanly possible. So on the final note, the last thing that I love doing, and similarly to using the HDR wheels mapped to the proper color gamut, I've been using in DaVinci Resolve the curves tool in a node following my LUT conversion, or whatever I'm doing to go from log to 709. After that 709 conversion, I use the curves tool, but I make sure that the gamma is mapped to Rec 709. What this allows is that final layer of contrast that I add to the image will be actually like really, really good and give me that like contrasty pop that I'm looking for, instead of having to, have it be a little bit outside of that range. Okay, so moving on to LUTs. Now, I feel like if you're in the photography world, there was this whole stigma around using Lightroom presets back in the day. And I think we've all come full circle and we understand that if you're buying presets from someone, it's usually a good starting place for you. And I want to make the case that LUTs aren't necessarily the same thing in the way that presets are. Now, creative LUTs across the board, very similar in that like you are getting that LUT to be able to have a creative look that someone else has created that you might like and enjoy. But when it comes to technical LUTs, I think this is something that we need to appreciate all of the extra hard work that goes into creating these things, because, I think that across the board, straight out of camera colors from all the manufacturers, regardless of who you're shooting on, and this is probably going to offend a lot of people, but they're not fantastic. I use the Panasonic basic 709 LUT, horrible. Canon, horrible. Sony, horrible. There's a lot of work that goes into creating the technical LUTs that I think everyone should have a base understanding of, so that they know why it's important to use them. And I think one of the reasons that straight out of camera colors from pretty much all manufacturers across the board don't look great, I know this might offend a few people, but I think that so much of what a camera manufacturer is trying to go for with their look compromises the ability for anyone to get really good colors out of those cameras down the road, because you're stuck with their interpretation of what green is supposed to be, what red is supposed to be, what magenta is supposed to be. And so once you, remove all of that, if you're starting with just a basic log profile and you're working with a really, really good technical LUT, that's something where you can actually overcome a lot of those limitations in the ability of that picture profile, because you're actually working with someone who took this camera sensor picture profile into a lab, shot the charts, did all the boring things, but they actually were able to create something that gave you a very neutral starting point to be able to actually build and layer your looks on top of that. While I've been absolutely pumped on DaVinci Resolve and the ability for it to speed up my color workflow and allow me to get way better colors out of cameras that I thought were a lost cause, let's return back to what I said at the beginning of this video in wanting to return back to Final Cut Pro for all of my wedding work. Now, what this is going to require is a nice base workflow to be able to get the most out of my cameras without having to rely on the basic color tools that are built into Final Cut. This is where Gamut comes in. I was super grateful to have been given some of their LUTs to work with, and I've been using them on my past couple of videos, and I'm really impressed with what they're able to do in terms of camera color matching. My last video I did talking about timecode, I think there was 5 or 6 different cameras across that video. My A-roll camera, the FX3, I shot all the B-roll on a Canon R6. There was the wedding footage from my S1H, a Sony A1, a Canon C70. You get the picture. Everything pretty much matched across the board, and for the most part, the only thing that I added on top of it was just like a nice little curve to give it a little bit of a contrast bump beyond just the Rec 709 conversion and like a little bit of like HDR processing. This is really exciting for someone like me who wants to edit all of their wedding films in Final Cut for the magnetic timeline, the automatic retiming tools, basic audio tools that are pretty great, and just the overall speed and efficiency of it. Now I can go back to Final Cut knowing that I'll be able to get the same level of color quality out of something that I would edit and resolve with the speed and efficiency. I'm super excited with everything they're doing at Gamut for the ability of this next generation of filmmakers to be able to focus on telling better stories and spend less time trying to get their colors right. Being able to get them really fantastic straight out of camera is going to be absolutely huge. And ultimately, at the end of the day, as filmmakers, we are here to capture and tell people's stories. And the less time we can spend futzing around with all of our gear and colors and post-production, and the more time we can spend getting out there and capturing those stories, the better for everyone. So I hope this video was helpful today, and if you liked it, awesome. There's more videos somewhere around here for you to watch, and I will see you guys in the next one.